A buddy of mine called me in a panic last spring because his 6-month-old rainwater tank had split clean down one side overnight, dumped 800 gallons across his yard, and took out a section of fence on the way down. No storm, no impact, nothing dramatic happened to it. It just failed, quietly, sometime in the night, while everybody was asleep. And he woke up to a yard that looked like a small flood had come through and a fence post lying flat in the mud, because of a mistake he made back when he first set the thing up and never thought twice about again. That call is what got me thinking I should actually sit down and go through the mistakes I see people make with these systems over and over. The ones that don't show up the day you build it, only months or years later when you've stopped paying attention and moved on to worrying about 100 other things around the property instead. Let's get into it. If you're new here, hit subscribe, because I get into this kind of real, tested off-grid systems pretty regularly. I already walked you through building a rainwater system from scratch in another video: catchment, first flush, storage, the whole build, start to finish. Everything you need to actually get water flowing off a roof and into a tank. This one's different. This is the list of ways people, myself included on a couple of these, get that build wrong in ways that don't announce themselves right away. Mistakes baked into a system that looks completely fine the day you finish it, sometimes for months or years after that, until whatever's been quietly wrong the whole time finally catches up with it. Some of these are the kind of mistake that costs you a tank. A couple of them are the kind that can actually make you sick, which is a different and more serious category entirely than just losing some water in a fence post. The kind of consequence that stays with a family long after any repair gets made. I want to go through them one at a time, because I think a lot of this stuff gets skipped over in the excitement of just getting water flowing. The same excitement that had me overlooking a couple of these myself back when I built my own system. More focused on the finish line than the ground I was actually standing it on. Mistake 1, and this is the one I think carries the most real risk out of everything on this list. Worth putting first specifically because it's the one where the consequences reach past just a broken tank and into actual health territory. Tying your rainwater system into your house plumbing or a well without a proper backflow preventer or air gap between the two. Here's why this matters more than people think, and it's worth slowing down on before moving to the rest of this list, because it's genuinely the mistake with the highest stakes attached to it. If your rainwater system ever gets cross-connected to your potable water line without protection, and pressure in that potable line ever drops, which happens more than you'd expect. A water main break somewhere upstream, a fire hydrant getting used nearby for actual firefighting or routine flow testing, even just routine maintenance work happening blocks away from your own property. That pressure drop can actually pull water backward through the connection, water flowing the exact opposite direction it's supposed to, because the whole system depends on pressure staying higher. On the clean side at all times, a balance that holds until the one moment something upstream disturbs it. Instead of your clean well or municipal water flowing out to fill things, your rainwater, untreated, unfiltered, whatever's actually in that tank, algae, bird droppings, whatever's been sitting on your roof between storms, dust, pollen, the occasional dead insect that never made it past a screen can get siphoned straight back into your drinking water system, contaminating not just your own tap, but potentially anything downstream of that connection too, spreading a problem that started in your own yard well past your own property line. This isn't a theoretical worry. It's exactly the mechanism that public water utilities spend real money and real staff time preventing. Entire departments dedicated to nothing but tracking down and eliminating exactly this kind of cross-connection. Because it's happened enough times to cause documented contamination events people actually got sick from. Real incidents with real names and real dates attached to them. Not hypothetical scenarios dreamed up to scare people into buying a part they don't need. Some states have made this a hard legal requirement specifically for rainwater systems over a certain size that share a property with another water supply, requiring a certified backflow assembly or a physical air gap. No exceptions. Sometimes even requiring a licensed plumber with a specific water protection endorsement to install it correctly. Treating this as serious enough that ordinary handyman work isn't considered sufficient. Even if your local rules don't spell it out that explicitly, the physics doesn't care what your local code says. Water finds the path of least resistance regardless of what any regulation happens to require in your particular county. If there's any chance your rainwater system and your other water supply could ever connect, even accidentally, even just once, that connection needs a backflow preventer or a physical air gap between them. Full stop. No workaround that gets you out of this one. No matter how careful you think you've been about keeping the two systems separate in every other respect. Mistake 2. And this is the one that actually happened to my buddy with the tank that split open in his yard. The exact failure I told you about at the start of this video finally getting its full explanation. Underestimating what a full tank actually weighs, and setting it on a foundation that was never built to hold that weight. Water weighs about 8 1/3 pounds per gallon, which sounds almost too simple to cause a problem until you do the math on an actual tank, instead of just a number on a spec sheet. A figure that stays completely abstract right up until you multiply it out against a real volume you're actually planning to store. A 1,000-gallon tank, which isn't even a particularly large one, weighs over 8,000 pounds full. And that number only climbs from there for anybody running a bigger setup. That's the weight of a loaded pickup truck sitting on whatever patch of ground or platform you picked to set that tank on, day after day, season after season, with no wheels to spread the load and no suspension to absorb any settling underneath it. Just dead static weight pressing down on the same 4 or 5 square feet of ground every single day of the year, without ever moving or shifting to relieve it. Bare dirt erodes and settles unevenly under that kind of load, especially anywhere water tends to pool or drain toward during a storm, softening exactly where you need firmness the most. Sand shifts and creates uneven point loads instead of spreading the weight out evenly the way a proper pad would. Individual grains rolling and settling under pressure instead of locking together into something stable. A wooden deck or platform that wasn't specifically engineered for that live load can fail slowly, sagging in one spot before anybody notices, putting a stress point on the tank wall it was never designed to handle. The kind of gradual failure that's almost impossible to catch just by eyeballing it from a few feet away. My buddy's tank had been sitting on a bed of loose gravel he'd leveled by eye instead of an actual pad, good enough looking at the time that neither of us thought twice about it when he first set it up. Both of us more focused on getting the gutters and the diverter dialed in than worrying about 6 inches of gravel underneath a tank that looked plenty stable, standing empty. Over 6 months of freeze and thaw cycles working underneath it, that gravel shifted just enough to put the tank slightly out of level. A difference small enough you'd never have spotted it without a level, and a lot of patience. Poly tanks are flexible by design, which is normally a strength, letting them handle minor settling and temperature swings without cracking outright the way a rigid material would under the same stress. But that flexibility means an uneven foundation doesn't just sit there looking crooked. It actively creates thin, overstressed spots in the tank wall that get worse every single time the water level rises and falls, the material working itself thinner and thinner at that one weak point with every single fill and draw cycle, essentially flexing itself toward failure a tiny bit at a time with each storm and each dry stretch that followed it. His tank wasn't a manufacturing defect. It was a foundation problem that took 6 months to finally show itself. Patient the whole time, waiting for exactly the wrong combination of pressure and stress to finally give. A slow accumulation of tiny failures that added up to one dramatic one the night it finally let go. Comment down below if you've ever had a tank or a barrel fail on you, Because I want to know how many of these stories out there trace back to exactly this same kind of foundation shortcut everybody takes when they're excited to just get the system running. More interested in seeing water flow than in spending an extra afternoon on something as unglamorous as a gravel pad. A trade a lot of us make without ever realizing we're making it. Mistake 3. And this one's sneaky because it's not even part of the rainwater system itself. It's something most people do to their roof for a completely unrelated reason and never connect back to the water sitting in their tank. 2 entirely separate decisions made at 2 entirely separate times that turn out to have everything to do with each other. If you've ever had zinc or copper strips installed along your roofline to control moss, and a lot of people up here in wet country have, that same rain running across those strips to keep your shingles clean is picking up trace amounts of heavy metal on its way down into your collection system. An invisible side effect nobody mentions when they're selling you on moss control. Zinc and copper both work as moss control because they're mildly toxic to plant life. That's the entire mechanism. Metal ions washing down the roof and disrupting the moss's ability to absorb nutrients and reproduce. A slow chemical drip doing its job one storm at a time, exactly as designed, for years on end without anybody having to reapply anything. Those same ions don't stop being toxic once they're sitting in your rain barrel instead of on your shingles. The chemistry doesn't know or care what container the water ends up in. Copper in particular is considerably more toxic to aquatic life than zinc. Somewhere in the range of 10 to 25 times more toxic by some estimates. Which matters a great deal if any of that water's eventually finding its way into a pond or a stream, and neither one is something you want concentrating in water you're planning on using for a vegetable garden, since plants will take up those same metals right along with the water you're feeding them. Meaning whatever's leaching off your roof could end up quietly working its way into whatever you're growing, and eventually eating too. If you've got moss control strips on your roof, and you're also collecting rainwater off that same roof, you've got 2 systems working directly against each other without realizing it. One designed to leach metal into the runoff specifically to kill living things. The other designed to collect that exact runoff for something you probably didn't want metal in. 2 perfectly reasonable decisions made independently, probably years apart and by different people entirely in some cases, that end up canceling out the good intentions behind both of them. Mistake 4. And this is the one that's easiest to put off until it's too late, since it only ever becomes a problem on the one night you forgot about it. And by then there's nothing left to do but survey the damage the next morning with a cup of coffee and a sinking feeling in your stomach. Not properly winterizing the system before a hard freeze. Water expands when it turns to ice, somewhere around 9% by volume, and that expansion is more than enough to split a tank seam, crack a fitting, or blow apart a length of pipe that had no room to accommodate it. The ice essentially acting like a slow-motion wedge working against whatever's containing it. Patient and relentless in a way no fitting or seam was ever designed to resist for long. The surest fix is also the simplest. Fully draining the tank and every connected pipe before temperatures drop and stay below freezing for any real stretch of time. No water left anywhere in the system for ice to have anything to work with. An approach that requires no special equipment at all, beyond just knowing to do it before the cold actually arrives instead of scrambling after the fact. But there's a detail in how you drain that trips people up even when they think they've done everything right. Don't close every valve completely once the tank's empty. Leave them cracked open instead, just slightly, enough to keep air moving through. A fully closed valve traps whatever residual water is left in that section of pipe. Water that never fully drained out just from gravity alone. And residual water sitting in a closed system is exactly what freezes and splits a fitting, even after you thought you'd already handled the problem and checked it off your list for the season. The single most vulnerable point in the whole system is usually the main valve right at the tank. The connection point that's most exposed to open air and least protected by the mass of water around it. Since a big tank full of water actually holds on to heat reasonably well even in cold weather, insulated by its own sheer volume in a way a small fitting never can be, But that one small valve sticking out has nothing insulating it at all. So if you're insulating anything, insulate that connection first and best, wrapping it properly with real pipe insulation instead of just tossing a tarp over the general area and calling it done, which does almost nothing against a genuine hard freeze, no matter how thorough it looks from a distance. Mistake 5, and this is the one almost nobody thinks about until water's already going somewhere it shouldn't, quietly working against the exact system it's connected to. Not planning where your overflow actually goes once the tank's full. Every storage tank needs an overflow. There's no way around a big rain event eventually filling any tank past capacity, no matter how generously you sized it. That's just basic math catching up with you during the one storm that finally exceeds your planning. But a lot of systems just route that overflow straight down onto the ground right next to the tank, without a second thought about what's underneath it or where that water's actually headed once it leaves the pipe. Do that long enough, especially right next to a foundation, a shed, or the tank's own base, and you're slowly undermining exactly the ground that whole heavy system is, depending on to stay stable. The same kind of erosion and settling problem that got my buddy's tank in trouble from a completely different angle. Just approaching the same weak point from the opposite direction, water finding its way underneath the pad, instead of the pad simply being poorly built in the first place. Route that overflow somewhere it can actually do some good instead. A rain garden, a swale, anywhere it can soak in gradually across a wider area instead of concentrating in one spot and slowly working against your own foundation, turning what should be a harmless safety feature into a slow-motion threat to the exact system it's supposed to be protecting. The very thing meant to save your tank from overfilling, ending up being what quietly undermines it instead. Mistake 6. And I'll admit, this one hits close to home given a video I made not too long ago about testing my own family's water system after realizing I'd been running on assumption for decades, trusting a track record instead of an actual result. The exact same mistake showing up in a completely different corner of this whole subject. Never actually testing your rainwater once the system's up and running. Treating the initial build as the last time water quality ever needs to cross your mind, as if getting everything installed correctly on day one is somehow a permanent guarantee instead of just a starting point. A system that was perfectly clean the day you built it doesn't necessarily stay that way forever, no matter how carefully you assembled it in the first place. Roofs age, sealants degrade, screens get damaged, and stop keeping out exactly what they were supposed to keep out. Gaps opening up slowly enough that nobody notices until something's already gotten through. Moss and organic buildup accumulating in spots you can't easily see from the ground. And none of that shows up as a visible change in the water sitting in your tank, which still looks perfectly clear the whole time regardless of what's actually accumulating in it. Betraying nothing about what's actually changed since the day everything was new. A yearly test, even just a basic one, costs a fraction of what any of these other mistakes cost you if they go undiscovered. And it's the one item on this whole list that actually gives you an early warning instead of just waiting silently for a failure to announce itself the way everything else on this list does. The one genuine exception to the pattern of invisible problems running through everything else I've covered here. I want to be honest that I've made a version of at least 2 of these mistakes myself over the years. Not because I didn't know better in the abstract, sitting here now able to explain the physics behind every one of them, but because in the moment of actually building something, the boring, unglamorous steps are always the easiest ones to shortcut when you're tired, behind schedule, or just eager to see the thing finally working. Nobody gets excited about a gravel pad or a backflow preventer the way they get excited about watching water finally flow through a system they built with their own hands. That first satisfying rush of a tank actually filling after weeks of planning and gathering parts. But those boring steps are exactly the ones that determine whether the system's still standing in 5 years or splitting open in your yard some quiet night, for no reason anybody can immediately explain. The glamorous part and the durable part turning out to be almost completely unrelated to each other. which is a lesson that applies to a lot more than just rainwater systems if you think about it long enough. Mistake 7. And this one ties back to something I touched on briefly in the original build video but didn't spend enough time on, which is neglecting your gutter screens and first flush chamber once the excitement of finishing the build wears off. These parts only do their job if somebody actually checks them. And they're exactly the kind of unglamorous maintenance that falls off everybody's list within the first season. Once the novelty of a working system settles into just being one more thing on the property that mostly takes care of itself, no different from a gutter on the house itself. Easy to trust blindly right up until the day it clearly isn't working anymore. A screen packed with needles and leaves doesn't fail dramatically. It just gradually lets more and more debris through. A slow creep from working perfectly to barely working at all, with no single obvious moment where it crossed that line. And a first flush chamber that never gets drained between storms stops doing its job just as quietly, sitting there full and useless the next time it rains instead of catching anything new. No different from having never installed one in the first place at that point. I check mine at the start of every season now. And again after any storm bad enough to really load up the gutters with debris. Because I learned the hard way that these are exactly the parts of a system built to be forgotten about. Right up until the day they've clearly stopped working and you're left wondering how long that's actually been the case. Running back through weeks or months of storms trying to guess when the actual failure point happened. Comment down below if you've got a maintenance routine of your own you'd add to this list. Because I'd be surprised if 7 mistakes covers everything worth knowing here. And I'd rather hear about the ones I missed from people who've actually lived through them than pretend this list is the final word on the subject. What ties all 7 of these together, if I'm honest, is that every single one of them is invisible, right up until it isn't. No warning light, no gradual creak that tips you off something's wrong before it actually goes wrong. Nothing that separates a healthy system from a failing one to the naked eye standing there looking at it on an ordinary afternoon. A bad foundation looks fine for months before it finally gives, holding steady through storm after storm right up until the exact combination of stress finally lines up against it. A cross-connection sits there doing nothing wrong for years until the one day the pressure happens to drop at exactly the wrong moment. Completely silent and undetectable the entire time it's actually a live risk. Working exactly as intended right up until the single afternoon it doesn't. Zinc leaching into your tank doesn't turn the water some obvious color that tips you off. It just quietly accumulates, batch after batch, with nothing to see or smell that would ever make you suspicious. None of these mistakes come with an early warning system built in. They just sit there, patient, waiting for the one set of conditions that finally exposes them, which is exactly why catching them before you build, instead of after something fails, is worth so much more than trying to diagnose the problem once your yard's already flooded or your water's already come back from a lab with numbers you didn't want to see. I'll put together a proper checklist video for anybody setting up a system from scratch. Something you can actually run through before you ever fill a tank instead of finding out the hard way which of these applies to your own setup. A punch list you can hold on to and actually check off item by item instead of relying on memory alone. Printed out and stuck to the inside of a shed door where you'll actually see it again instead of buried in a video you watched once and forgot about. For now, if you've already got a system running, it's worth a walk around it this week with this list in mind. Coffee in hand, actually looking instead of just glancing at it on your way past to some other chore. Check your foundation for level. Check whether anything ties back to your house plumbing without protection. Check your roof for moss treatment you might have forgotten was even there. Something installed by a previous owner or a company you hired years ago and never thought about again. A detail buried deep enough in the property's history that it never occurred to you it might still be actively affecting anything today. None of that takes long, 20 minutes at most for most setups. A small enough time investment that there's really no honest excuse for skipping it once you know what you're actually looking for. And every single one of these mistakes is cheaper to fix now than it is to discover the hard way. The way my buddy found out, in his yard, at 8,000 pounds, in the middle of the night. With a fence post to replace, and a whole tank's worth of water soaked into ground that took most of the summer to fully dry back out. A whole season of side effects traced back to one gravel pad that never got the attention it deserved. I'm Cole Ashford. Thank you for listening.